Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Chef has been our sponsor for the podcast from ChefConf here in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Habitat, InSpec, and Chef's focus on continuous automation at chef.io. Hey, it's Alex Williams, the New Stack, here at ChefConf in Austin, Texas, and I'm here with Michael Ducey, a friend and colleague in the business for a long time. Good to see you, Michael.
Good to see you, Alex.
And you work on Habitat. Tell us about what your role is.
Well, for better or worse, I guess, I do product marketing, which is, I tell people that, and then they're like, oh, wow, you're extremely technical for someone who does product marketing. But I do have a background in technology, and what I like about my job right now is basically trying to help people understand the problems that Habitat solves.
Right.
It covers a big, broad space, and so trying to distill it down into patterns and ideas and contextualize it for people is something that is kind of a passion of mine.
I remember a conversation we had a few years back, and it was something I've thought about a lot. And I'm not sure who you were with at the time, but you live in the Midwest, right?
Right. Yep.
And you were talking about, the West Coast and how from an alien land it can sometimes be, especially when you're going through the Midwest and you're talking to companies who, make dog food or whatever it is, right? And how obvious it was about this gap between actually what was being practiced by these companies in these places versus what was being developed out on the West Coast.
That's right.
What are you seeing now? What is it like? Is it closing and probably widening too at the same time?
It's closing and widening, but the super interesting thing is I always use the analogy of phones in like Africa, right? Nobody's buying landlines in Africa, right? There was never the infrastructure to widely deploy landlines in Africa, and they've skipped this whole generation and going directly to mobile, right? So what we're seeing a lot of organizations do is that they're just skipping that whole period of using cloud correctly and Amazon and all of those things and jumping right to the container world, right? And instead of going through this long life cycle of 2 to 3 years or 4 years of improving their processes and operations of how they run VMs, they're just skipping over that process and going directly into the container world.
I love it. It reminds me of films where there's this depiction of like the people who are moving really fast and they're really modern, but then there's someone in the Midwest, wherever it is, they'll be like, yep, but actually they're really, really smart, right? And they're really kind of taking their time, and then they come up with something that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And the nice thing is you can always have. There's an advantage to being a second mover, right? And that second mover, that laggard, can kind of learn from the experiences of others, and you definitely do see that in the Midwest. And Chicago is a great tech hub of the Midwest, not to downplay, the Midwest and saying that we're all backwards there.
Right.
But getting the learnings and experiences out of the way and having someone else take care of them for you, it can be super beneficial.
Super beneficial. Yeah. So. Let's turn to Habitat. First of all, if you could just describe it for us, for people who may not be familiar with it, and I have some questions about it. So if you could just help us understand Habitat.
Sure. It's an interesting one to try and explain in a concise sentence. So the way that I always like to explain it is that it takes care of two things for you. So the very first thing that it takes care of is describing the build lifecycle of your application. So every single application is going to have a build lifecycle, how you download the software, how you verify that you downloaded the right thing, how you unpack that software, how you compile it, how you turn it into the artifact that actually produces a working application, right? And then the second thing that Habitat does is helps you define what the run lifecycle of that application is. And what's super interesting is that once you've defined the build lifecycle and the run lifecycle, you package them up into one artifact that you ship together, right? And you can kind of see that similar idea with what we do with containers, right? But containers is just yet another artifact format, right? And if you think about it, containers are actually kind of uninteresting because they are just like another RPM, right? And as Kelsey Hightower has said at one point in time, it's like we wouldn't have RPM conference, but we have like, you know, container conferences and other stuff like that. So if you think about it, the container format is just a way to push an artifact. But what Habitat does is you can take this artifact, and because you have knowledge about how to run that application, you can take it with the Habitat supervisor and automatically run your application how you've defined it inside of that application artifact.
And it was also described, I think, you know, I think what you went into some detail. Simply, they were describing it yesterday as packaging for containers. Do you think that's too broad, or is that just a convenient way to help people think about it?
It's a convenient way to help people think about it, because what we find is that there's a lot of problems that Habitat solves that you may not have necessarily felt yet unless you're going down that route of doing containers and doing highly distributed systems and microservices.
Exactly.
So when we contextualize it in the container world, then it makes a lot more sense. We also think, though, that Habitat has some great benefits in the container world in that making it easier to build containers. And also when you build that resulting container or export it to whatever format you want, you know exactly what's inside of that object. Versus going to Docker Hub and just getting something that you don't necessarily know who built it or where it came from.
So that makes me think of JFrog and like your relationship with them and binaries, and I mean, is that part of the equation then, to think about not, you know, providing customers with some trust that, you know, that what they're actually pulling in is authenticated?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we have in Habitat, and we're adding in more, so that you know that when you download this artifact, that it was actually generated by someone that you can trust, and you know exactly what's inside of it. And then when you build your application based on those artifacts, you would know where that came from and have that. I can never say the word correctly. Maybe you can help me. Provenance. Yeah, of knowing exactly where that thing came from and that object came from.
So, going back to like Habitat and its roots, and what's striking to me is like these. You know, you're talking about jumps that you see the end users make, and there seems to be an interesting, you know, progress, evolution of Chef in itself, and and Habitat and what it does, right? I mean, and you know, there's so much hype, right, that we hear all the time, right? And people say, "Oh, configuration management, it's done," you know. But actually, what you guys have done is built.
I think we've actually had that conversation.
Yes,
before.
we have. Yes, I have. And there was, I remember it very well. But you know, what it seems to me, what you guys have done is you've like taken that, you know, that technology that you've developed over the years and almost like baked it into Habitat in itself. And because it is a configuration technology in itself, in many ways, right?
So I guess I had this realization, and I know kind of like where that thought became really well formed was I was studying in Amsterdam with a good friend at a cafe. It was a beautiful day, and a guy by the name of Funs Kessen. And we kind of had this conversation going back and forth, and then basically what everything has come down to in the world of technology is artifact management. And so everything is an artifact, and if you think that everything is an artifact, then there is a common way that you can manage the release of that artifact. And you see that in this idea of release pipeline models, or doing continuous delivery on anything, right? And so whether if it's a JSON blob of code that you're going to be pushing through in a file, whether if it's a VM and you're going to be building a new VM image every time, or a container image, that management cycle can look the same over and over and over again. And I think Habitat is kind of that coming together of that idea of that everything is an artifact. And then when you manage your artifacts correctly, it's overall easier to manage your application and your infrastructure in a very similar way, right? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yes, because you're gonna have more artifacts all the time.
You're going to have more and more artifacts all the time. And so here's what's happened if you look at the way the operating system has evolved, is you have a set of operating system artifacts, and then you have a set of application artifacts, right? The two tend to be generally disjointed from one another, even though there's some relation between them one another and dependency between the operating system artifacts and your application artifacts. What Habitat does is now the operating system artifacts are treated like application artifacts, and you manage them in the same way. So if you're going to go release your application and you need a certain version of glibc or you need a certain version of the Ruby interpreter, then you can have Habitat manage those application dependencies for you, and you're decoupled now from your operating system completely.
So, is Habitat is it mostly designed to be used on the desktop at this point? Because you guys talked about the platform today, and I think of the platform more as something for best fitted to the service providers, Azure and AWS, for example.
No, Habitat's solely focused on kind of more of the server side of things and distributed computing, right?
Great.
And so the interesting thing about what Habitat does is to run systems effectively at scale, you need to have some knowledge about how to run distributed systems, right? And kind of going back to Adam Jacobs' keynote this morning at ChefConf, talking about this idea of promise theory and having expectations. What Habitat does is it bakes a lot of that knowledge into what we call the supervisor to run distributed systems effectively, and how to have those promises of, if I need to deploy to a leader-follower topology, I can tell the supervisor that and have expectations that the supervisor is going to behave the way I expect.
Okay. So what's distinguishing about platform then? If you're going to, we're talking about, the use of Habitat, among, in a service provider environment.
Yeah. The interesting thing about platform is, and this idea that the Habitat platform, what it gives you, is that from a service provider perspective, you have to consistently deploy services, right? So your application developers want things like a Redis cluster stood up for you, for them, an Elk stack, a MongoDB cluster, right? And from a service provider perspective, you want to try and minimize the amount of variance between having to deploy each one of those services over and over and over again in a consistent, highly scalable fashion. So what Habitat gives you and the Habitat platform gives you is that no matter if you want to deploy MongoDB or Redis or an Elk stack, you could basically have the exact same commands that you run over and over again to manage that stack, to deploy a new instance of that stack, to automatically scale that stack up, and then also to do updates and other things like that on that stack.
Last year at this time, Habitat was brand new, right?
Yep.
You just introduced it, and in the past year, I'm sure you've seen all kinds of developments and how it can be used. But it seems like Kubernetes is rising as a use case that you're focusing on. Is that, explain that and help us understand. Like, did you see it last year at this time last year that this? That Kubernetes and orchestrators would be important, and because a lot of them, but yesterday I heard just Stroud and others say that containers are here to stay, and I'm not sure someone would have said that last year. They may have said containers are definitely showing up more.
Right.
They're definitely more important, but I don't think anyone would have said last year that,
Containers have won.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we see Kubernetes as definitely as the community that is taking the world by storm, right? But in the world of container orchestrators, you still need somebody to orchestrate the actual application that's inside of those containers. So you have to remember that containers, once again, are just an artifact format, right? Just a packaging technology.
Okay.
And you still have to make decisions about how you actually build and run that application inside of that container and scale that application. And there's definitely some things that Kubernetes can automatically do for you, but there's still decisions that the application needs to make. So what you typically see in a containerized world is you build those assumptions directly into your application itself, right? Whereas Habitat gives you a framework that already has a lot of those assumptions built in for you inside of that framework. So you're not having to, for every single application, solve those distributed system problems.
Right. And so Kelsey Hightower did a demo today, and he was showing how to update, right? You know, update the habitat.
Yep.
And he used OK Google and all that, and it was a really good demo. What are the things that you're doing now with, you know, what are some of the major kind of milestones you're trying to reach now with Habitat on Kubernetes? With Kubernetes.
The main thing that we're looking at doing is more how we can inform, one, pull information from the Kubernetes API into the supervisor so that we can make intelligent decisions about how to deploy an application and like set up the application when it launches. And then the other thing that we're looking is how can we push information into Kubernetes so that things like services can have the right labels to do selection and other things like that. Kelsey definitely showed some great integrations that kind of natively exist just because we provide an API.
Right.
And being able to query Habitat-based containers for health checks and stuff like that. And that's just because we had the foresight, I guess you could say, to build in a REST-based API for doing health checks and other things like that. I think the main focus are on data exchange right now, so that the applications you build with Habitat and Kubernetes can be a little bit more rich, and we're kind of already defining those patterns for you out of the box.
So it has the APIs built in.
So the Habitat has the APIs built in, so that Habitat supervisors essentially have a REST-based API where you can do things like to query the health of the application. You can query the health of the ring, so that also has a gossip protocol built in that lets you automatically peer and build what we call service groups of applications. And then also exchange information between service groups as well. So all of that information is exposed via an API that something like Kubernetes could take advantage of, or other container orchestration platforms.
So what are some of the kind of the milestones you're trying to reach then for you know, over the next 3 to 6 months? You know, that we'll see upstream.
Yeah, so I think the biggest milestone, at least from a Habitat perspective, not necessarily a Habitat and Kubernetes perspective, the first one is launching the build service fully. So we announced the build service, an early version of the build service right now. And what the build service allows you to do is basically take any of those Habitat artifacts and have them automatically rebuilt. So if you have a vulnerability in a low-level library, you can have it automatically rebuilt. Your application can be automatically rebuilt as well based upon that change. And then you could export a container that has the new version of that library as well, right? And then that container would go up to a registry, and then Kubernetes could pick it up automatically and do that rolling deploy that you expect. The other thing that we're looking at doing is investigating what we could do from third-party operators inside of Kubernetes as well. And we're working with a couple partners to figure out what that integration might look like. And it could be as far as deploying Habitat supervisors, it could be making configuration changes. It could be interacting with the Habitat API as well.
So third-party operators who
third-party operators in Kubernetes, which is a beta feature of Kubernetes.
Right. Okay. What would that solve for the end user then? The continuous automation issue that?
It mainly would solve some of the integration points of bootstrapping new applications onto Kubernetes and bringing up a new Habitat-based application, having kind of a stable endpoint to go and ask questions to about what other services are running, what other Habitat-based services are running, and so forth.
Because as the community grows, you're going to need more of that, too.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you for taking some time to talk here at ChefConf. It's good to see you again.
Definitely good to see you again, Alex.
Thanks. Chef has been our sponsor for the podcast from ChefConf here in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Habitat, Inspec, and Chef's focus on continuous automation at chef.io. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Bakers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.